I understand wanting to have it black and white, no questions. Here's the problem. That's not how God gave us the Bible. No two Greek manuscripts read identical to one another. Erasmus had to examine manuscripts, and he made choices. Erasmus was a Roman Catholic priest. He was not infallible. He wrote in defense of transubstantiation in the Mass. I would have debated Erasmus had I lived in his day. So we have to examine the scholarship that was used then. If they used textual critical scholarship to choose between manuscripts, and even the King James translators, these two texts do not read identical to one another. The King James translators had to make choices even between the printed texts that they used. And so if we did it from 1604 to 1611, why do we stop there? The King James translator never said that we were to stop there. They never even suggested that this was the final word in all things. And so we have to continue on. If the King James translators were here today, they would not be King James onlyists, because they believed in the necessity of revision, the examination of manuscripts, and if they had available to them what we have available to us, they certainly would not take the position that is taken by King James only representatives today. Yeah. And in fact, I did want to correct just one misapprehension. Sinaiticus was not found in or near a trash can. That is a common myth, but it's untrue. All you have to do is read Constantine von Tischendorf's own first-hand account of his discovery of the manuscript. A monk brought it out of the closet of his cell wrapped in red cloth. Folks, people in monasteries do not wrap garbage in red cloths, okay? This was a text that had been in use for 1,500 years at that time. But that text right there is not based simply upon Aleph and B, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Since the 1930s, we have discovered a number of papyri manuscripts that go far closer to the original than any work of antiquity. When I debated Bart Ehrman, he admitted in our cross-examination section, he said the New Testament is the earliest attested document from all antiquity. He could have said also the most widely attested document of all of antiquity. We can get much closer to the originals than any other work of antiquity in those papyri manuscripts. And what do those papyri manuscripts tell us? That Sinaiticus and Vaticanus represent the text from the 2nd century. There is no Byzantine manuscript, a manuscript that contains specifically and only Byzantine readings until the 4th or 5th century. And so we're talking about the earliest, most primitive manuscripts. And they didn't all come from Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria, the library there had people coming and going from all over the world. And the idea that, well, Alexandria is full of heretics. Folks, the Byzantine manuscripts come from around the area of Byzantium. Arianism was very strong in that area. And the person who defended the deity of Christ against the Arians after the Council of Nicaea was a man named Athanasius. And he became bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. So anybody can make an argument in regards to church history. I would just simply challenge Pastor Moorman this evening, show us any evidence that any of these manuscripts were touched by, influenced by, tinged by any heretic that you can name. And we can then deal with that kind of assertion that is made. But just simply making a general assertion doesn't work. Now, I believe in the deity of Christ. I wrote a book called The Forgotten Trinity. I debate Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Unitarians, all the time on the subject of the deity of Christ. The modern translations based upon the Nestle-Aland 27th edition are in much better shape to defend the deity of Christ than if you're utilizing the Byzantine text. Now, I realize that there are texts where the King James testifies the deity of Christ that modern translations do not. One of the most famous is 1 Timothy 3:16. In 1 Timothy 3:16, in the King James Bible, it says, God was manifest in the flesh. In modern translations, it simply says, he who was manifest in the flesh. And that sounds, you can build a real conspiracy on that. That sounds like those rascally modern translators. And I've worked as a critical consultant on the New American Standard Bible for the Lockman Foundation. We are conservative men in the work that we do. We believe in the deity of Christ. We defend the deity of Christ. So why is there such a difference? Well, let me explain to you the fact that in the earliest manuscripts, and what's called the unsealed text, the majuscule, the original manuscripts of the New Testament written in all capital letters, no punctuation, no space between words. Lots of fun to read. Now, in those capital letter forms, the early Christians developed something called the nomina sacra, the sacred names. They would actually use abbreviations to try to get more onto a page. Most of the early Christians were poor people. And in fact, remember, the church is under persecution for the first 300 years of its existence. You couldn't go to the rich people to have nice manuscript copies made at that particular point in time. And so they would use these abbreviations for like God, Jesus, Spirit, common words. They would abbreviate them as one or two letters and put a line over top of them. God was one of the words that they did this with. Now, when we hear the difference between God and he who, that sounds like a big difference. But I'd like to show you something on the screen that shows you what the difference between these two words is. If we could bring that up, you'll be able to see that in the original language, the term God is two letters, and the word he who is two letters. There you can see it. I'm not sure if the audience can see it. Yeah. But you can see the term God, theta sigma with a line on top, and then omicron sigma is hos. The only difference between these two words are two little lines. And remember what you're originally writing on. Papyrus, which is made up of leaves that are pressed together, crossed like this, or leather manuscripts, vellum, all of which have what in them? Lines. And you're reading somebody else's handwriting. It's very easy to understand. No reason for conspiracies here. It's very easy to understand why someone would misunderstand or misread someone else's handwriting. And at the bottom of that screen was a shot from Codex Sinaiticus. And you can see that its original reading was hos, and then about 700 years later, someone had written theos in above it. You can see it in the second line toward the end, where someone has made an emendation about 700 years after the original writing. So every time there is a text where there is a difference in regards to the deity of Christ or anything else, I've examined every single one of them. In John 1:18, for example, the King James does not contain a reference to the deity of Christ that is found in the modern translations, where Jesus is described as monogenes theos, the unique God, the one who has exegeted or revealed the Father. So in every single one of these instances, there is no reason to think that there's some type of conspiracy. There's no reason to think that modern translators, and by the way, please, I hope you hear me here. I am a conservative. I do not defend all modern translations. There are garbage modern translations. There are cultic modern translations, like the New World Translation. We all recognize doesn't even really deserve the name translation at all. That's just a perversion of the Bible. And unfortunately, it's Europe that produces most of the liberal stuff. But there are fine, excellent, conservative translations of the New Testament that will give a much more consistent and full testimony to the deity of Christ, not only because of the text they use, but also because we have grown in our understanding of the Greek language. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was a man by the name of Granville Sharp. And Granville Sharp recognized something about the Greek language. There's a set of rules named after him called the Granville Sharp construction. And in Titus 2:13 and 2 Peter 1:1, we have references where Jesus is identified as God. And in fact, in Titus 2:13 it says, our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. In 2 Peter 1:1, our God and Savior, Jesus Christ. That rule was discovered after the translation of the King James Version of the Bible. The translators of the King James were much more familiar with Latin. And so they do not translate the Granville Sharp constructions at those places as clearly as we do today. And in fact, many people can look at the King James rendering and they say, well, it says our God and our Savior. Those two different people. Well, the rule says they're one person. That's why it should be translated, our God and Savior, Jesus Christ. So one of my questions this evening for you in the audience, and especially for Pastor Mormon, is this. Is there any place in the King James where we've come up with a better translation than what appeared in 1611? I would expect you would have to believe that, because no one here uses the 1611 KJV. If you're reading a standard King James Version today, you're using the 1769 Blaney revision. That's what's normally printed, but there's two editions of that, the Oxford and the Cambridge edition, and they're not identical to one another. Almost nobody reads the 1611. But even if you did, then you would know that there were changes made after the 1611. And so, which one's the final authority? Even as the King James translators were producing their text, the different committees did not translate things in the same way. In Matthew, they translate the commandment, uphanusis, you shall not murder, one way. And then in Romans, they translate, you shall not kill. It might be kill and murder, depending on Matthew or Romans. Two different committees translating the very same Old Testament commandment in two different ways. I've even had atheists use that as an example of contradiction in the Bible. Now, the question is, will Pastor Mormon admit that it would be better to translate uphanusis as thou shalt not murder in both places, smooth that out, Would it not be best to fix the translation of Romans 9:5 so that it is as clear in its testimony of the deity of Christ as the New King James Version is? And what about those places where the Textus Receptus is absolutely alone in its reading? No Greek manuscript in the world ever has what it has in its reading. For example, in Revelation chapter 16, verse 5, both of these texts, and I can show you right where they are, both of these texts used by the King James translators in Revelation 16:5 speak of God as the one who is and who was the Holy One. Hasios is the Greek term. Both of them say the same thing. In 1598, Beza made what's called a conjectural emendation. That is, he conjectured. He looked at the form of the word and he said, I bet that was originally esamenos, which means and shall be. And so that's what he put in his Greek text. And that's what the King James translators translated. No one before 1598 reading a Greek New Testament had ever seen that before. It's in the King James Version to this day. Why? Because, folks, fundamentally, what all this boils down to is this. What I want in a Bible translation is what John wrote in the book of Revelation. I want what he wrote in the Gospel of John. I want what Paul wrote in Romans. I don't want what a scribe wrote or thought should have been written 1,000 years later, even if that becomes the most popular text. There's a reason why the Byzantine text is most popular. Again, Latin Vulgate in the West, all the other places where Greek was being spoken, taken over by Islam. Guess what place is left over producing Greek manuscripts? The area around Byzantium. And so the text type that was predominant there becomes the vast majority. But the vast majority of those come from after 1,000 years after Christ. If you just look at the first 1,000 years of church history, the majority text is not the Byzantine text, it's the Alexandrian text. And so if your arguments produces a different text, depending on where you are in church history, that might be a bit of a problem. I want to know what the original writers wrote. And God has given us the means to know that. We have such a tremendous wealth. There's nobody has what we have when it comes to the New Testament. People ask, though, well, why couldn't God have avoided textual variation? Folks, you need to realize that the way God did this is as soon as the gospel goes out into the world, the Christians want everybody to hear it, and so they let everyone copy their manuscripts. Thousands of those manuscripts were destroyed by Roman soldiers, and the people who possessed them killed. Many survive to our day, thankfully. But they wanted that out there. They didn't say, are you a professional scribe? We want to make sure that you don't make any mistakes here. They didn't do that. What that results in is a manuscript tradition that goes all over the world. You know why that's so important? You know what you hear my Muslim friends say? Oh, you all put the deity of Christ in the New Testament. You all put the resurrection in the New Testament. Folks, that's absolutely impossible. There was never a time when anyone had control over all the manuscripts of the New Testament. Constantine, remember the Da Vinci Code? Oh, Constantine collected all the Gospels and destroyed them and wrote these 4. That is absurd and easily demonstrated to be completely bogus. We can demonstrate that what we have in the New Testament is what the apostles communicated. The cost of that was having to compare manuscript with manuscript in regards to spellings of words and orders of words and whether a phrase is there or whether a phrase is not. But the other cost would have been far greater. For if we only had one manuscript, then we'd have to trust that whoever controlled that one manuscript never tampered with it. That's the problem the Muslims have. They have a revised text. They have to trust that Uthman got it exactly right. We don't have to do that. We actually have the better situation. God provisionally has provided us with a solid foundation for believing in the inspiration and accuracy of the New Testament. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you. You've sat and listened very patiently to both. Let's take a few comments from the audience. If you've got a comment, remember, we're not talking about preaching. Put your hand up if you've got a comment. Yep, there's one over here.
Yes, Pastor White. I'm not an academic, in spite of what the BBC say about me. When I open the authorized, so-called authorized version, I see something about to the high and mighty King James. And then there's actually a book called James. But in the Hebrew,